Welcome to episode 217 of 10 Minute Record Reviews. This time I'm going to talk about the Jazz Crusaders album Tough Talk from 1963 on Pacific Jazz. This is a first pressing of same. So the Jazz Crusaders, sometimes known as the Crusaders, are one of the longest lasting jazz combos in music history. They're friends from high school in Houston in the 1950s who recorded together for 50 years, almost without a break, their last records coming out in the early 2000s. They began as an R&B outfit. In 1955, they switched to hard bop. By 1969-70, they moved over pretty much fully into funk, where they stayed for a number of years. They were never one thing, and they were always capable of all kinds of styles. Perhaps because of their ease with all these different kinds of styles, they never got much respect from jazz critics, even though when they did play hard bop, it was pretty much top-ranked stuff. This record is from 1963. It's from their hard bop period, not from the 70s when they were known as the Crusaders. Regardless of the period, their recordings are increasingly appreciated. You can still get them relatively inexpensively, so I would recommend picking up some of those early pressings while you still can, while it's still a bargain. There have been a number of players in the group over the years, but there are basically four core members throughout the history of the group, and those are Wayne Henderson on trombone, Wilton Felder on tenor sax, Joe Sample on keyboards, and Stix Hooper on drums. In the early 1950s, when he was about 15 in Houston, Nesbitt Hooper, known as Stix because he didn't like the first name Nesbitt, forms a group called the Swingsters. This group commonly had up to 8 members, but by 1955, Sample, Felder, Hooper, and Henderson were all on board. In their earliest incarnations, they were basically an R&B cover band who played a little bit of jazz on the side. But the turning point comes in 1955 when they go to see the performance of Jazz at the Philharmonic, which was this jazz tour organized by Norman Granz, which came to Houston that year. I mentioned Granz in a review I just did on Tel Farlow, and he is a legendary record executive. He founded no fewer than 5 separate labels. One of his other main claims to fame was organizing these tours called Jazz at the Philharmonic, and along with many of the black artists who came along with him on these tours, he was a leader in challenging the racism and the segregation which they encountered in various parts of the U.S. Before the gig, Granz and Illinois Jacquet made it very clear to the local promoters that the show was not going to be segregated, and Granz personally went around the stadium and took down all the segregated washroom signs. The show featured Jacquet, but also some much bigger names, Ella Fitzgerald and Dizzy Gillespie, and the city government basically required the cops to accept the fact that this was not going to be a segregated show. The white cops, of course, weren't going to take this lying down. Cops had never been fans of jazz, regardless of where you were in the States. It was associated with black people making money, it was associated with drugs, it was associated with black people who had money doing drugs, and so on. These were all things which were top priorities for police officers. So while theoretically allowing this desegregated show to go ahead in its classic passive-aggressive move, they raid the dressing rooms looking for a pretext to disrupt the show, and what they find is Illinois Jacquet playing dice. So they arrest him, they arrest Dizzy Gillespie, they arrest Ella Fitzgerald, who was literally doing nothing more than eating a sandwich. They take them down and they book them. Granz basically has a showdown with the cops. Some of them were trying to plant drugs in the dressing room, apparently. Anyway, he gets people released. This is quite a famous episode. The charges were eventually dismissed. The audience didn't know a heck of a lot about what was actually going on because this all happened in the dressing rooms and off stage in between the two sets of the show. For the young swingsters who attended the show, they were focused on the music and they were absolutely blown away. From that point on, they were going to focus on hard bop, on modern jazz, and to reflect this change, they changed their name from the Swingsters to the Modern Jazz Sextet. The sextet at this point consisted of Sample, Felder, Henderson, Hooper, the bassist Henry Wilson, and a flute player by the name of Hubert Laws. In 1958, recognizing that Houston was probably not the place to build a jazz career, en masse, they resolved to leave Houston and move to Los Angeles. They wrote to 4 or 5 labels before they left. They got one audition, and so they go out there, but the audition never actually happened. So they are in LA, and they've got to make some money, and they do know how to play R&B, so they start moonlighting to make some money as a group called the Nighthawks. And the reason why they chose Nighthawks was because Stix Hooper's real name is Nesbitt. His initials were NH, and they had NH stenciled on their music stands, and so they needed a name which went with NH. They were developing as a group, but in 1960 they lost the services of Hubert Laws, who won a scholarship to Juilliard. Laws, of course, would go on to a remarkable career as a classical performer, yes, with the Met and with the New York Philharmonic, but also in jazz, jazz funk, and even Latin music. His departure meant they needed a name change because they were a sextet, and now they had to become a quintet. Stix Hooper's wife suggests the name Crusaders. What they decide is to add jazz in front of that as a bit of a nod to Art Blakey's Jazz Messengers. As a quintet, their sound began to gel, not least because of Henderson's trombone and Felder's sax, which was an unusual front line for groups on the West Coast at the time, and they got a lot of critical notice as a consequence. And eventually, a guy called Dick Bach, who ran Pacific Jazz Records, signs into a contract somewhere in the winter of 1960-61. As I mentioned, when they signed, they were a quintet, but basically the bass chair was always rotating throughout the 1960s. In 1970, Felder takes over on bass on a more permanent basis. He wasn't just pinch hitting, he was actually a phenomenal bassist, and through the 60s and the 70s, he was a sideman on bass for all kinds of pretty sort of A-list talent. But in the early 1960s, he's pretty much just on tenor sax. Wilson leaves. He's replaced by Jimmy Bond for a couple of records, Freedom Sound in 1961 and Looking Ahead in 1962. 1963, they made a live album at the Lighthouse Cafe in Hermosa Beach, and the bassist there is a guy called Victor Gaskin. And by the time they get to make this record in 1963, Bobby Haynes is coming on bass. This record is made February 13th and 19th, 1963 at Pacific Jazz Studios in Hollywood. Henderson's on trombone, Felder's on tenor sax, Hooper's on drums, Sample's on keyboards, and of course the bassist du jour is Bobby Haynes. The producer is the aforementioned Dick Bach. Bach himself was from Syracuse, New York, so how does he end up in LA? Well, during the war he was too young to do a heck of a lot, but he did join the Coast Guard in the very closing months of the war. He leaves the service in LA and he starts taking college classes there, but he has also at the same time really caught the jazz bug and the record industry bug. He works in a record store, then he worked part-time for a small label called Black and White, and then he moves to Discovery Records. Discovery was a very short-lived label run by a guy called Albert Marks. They were only around for a few years, but they did manage to record people like Dizzy Gillespie, Zoot Sims, Red Norvo, Art Pepper, and George Shearing. He starts his own label in 1952, Pacific Jazz, later becomes World Pacific, later becomes acquired by Liberty. The labels are actually a little bit confusing all the way through the 60s for that label. His very first release was an absolute classic, the Jerry Mulligan Quartet, which happened to feature on trumpet Chet Baker, and throughout its history, Pacific had a roster of really quite incredible talent, including Mulligan, Baker, Bud Shank, Zoot Sims, Lee Konitz, Chico Hamilton, Bob Brookmeyer, and Jim Hall. Side one starts with Deacon Brown, and the group kicks off the record by just racing through this Wilton Felder composition with its memorable riff. Then we have a change of pace with the exotic-sounding Turkish Black, which has a bunch of time signature changes which are a little bit challenging, but the group skates through those just fine. Is this a play on Blue Rondo a la Turk? Well, maybe, although actually it's a little bit more take five in the way that they play with the time signatures. Brahms' Lullaby is next. It is exactly what it says in the tin, the famous lullaby, which they get out of the way in the head arrangement. Once that's done with, then Felder is just ripping on tenor through the rest of the track. Final track on side one is Boopy, another Felder track, which is another Felder riff fest, followed by Sample, and then Hooper gets his first real moment in the sun. All four tracks in side one are pretty much hard bop. A bit of a switch at the beginning of side two with Tough Talk, the title track, which is very much soul jazz, and I think very much intended as a single, which it was released as in a year or so. No Name Samba by Felder is next. Recall, of course, this is the height of the bossa nova boom, and so anybody who is anybody had at least one bossa track on their jazz records at the time. This is actually a bit of a crossover piece. It's a bossa nova kind of blended with a blues structure. My regret is this has faded out way too soon, just as Felder is starting what sounds like an awesome solo. Lazy Canary is next, and all is good because we get plenty of Felder on this. This is pretty much right back into the hard bop lane. There's tons of great Wayne Henderson playing on trombone here as well. Lonely Horn is next. This is just sultry and delicious. Both Felder and Henderson get turns being the titular Lonely Horn. Not sure why this track hasn't featured on an episode of Bosch yet, but totally should be. Producers take note. Then the record closes with Brother Bernard, which is pretty much standard issue hard bop, but very well played. This record's a pretty good record, and it's kind of fascinating too when you think about the later history of the group. A lot of jazz groups at the time would include a song which they thought would have popular appeal, which took them slightly out of the hard bop lane on their album, but it's unusual to have two such tracks, especially so well executed. These guys, of course, had started in R&B, and with hindsight, it's probably possible to see that they must have been getting itchy feet, seeing the world of popular music and soul music kind of exploding all around them. We might not be at 1970 yet, of course. This is still the Jazz Crusaders, not the Crusaders. This record's largely full of very well executed hard bop, but the evolution, again, in hindsight, seems kind of obvious. This record for me is 4 out of 5 stars.